Good morning. My name is Maggie Hartley, and I'm the Assistant Director of Public Engagement here at the National World War II Museum. Thank you for joining us for today's Lunchbox lecture. Today's lecture is entitled Winning the Peace, MacArthur and the Occupation of Japan, with Amanda Williams, the Education Manager at the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. This Lunchbox lecture was rescheduled due to Hurricane Ida's impact on southeastern Louisiana and was designed to commemorate the end of the war in the Pacific. So now, without further ado, I will now turn this over to Amanda to share about General MacArthur's unique approach to the occupation of Japan.
Thank you, Maggie. And thank you to the World War II Museum for having me. Today, I'm going to give you an overview of the occupation of Japan and try to explain why it can be considered one of the most effective occupations in history. And I think, as history demonstrates, great battlefield victories can often unravel in the occupations that follow them. Occupations are less formal fields of battle, where you can lose the luster of a great battlefield victory. And although dismissed as the end of a conflict, an occupation is basically just a reconfiguration of the battlefield and is therefore a very vital arena where peace can be won or lost. And I think when you think about the bitter fighting that took place in the Pacific during World War II, in the September of 1945, the occupation of Japan was a very daunting prospect, and I think it had the potential to really end in a very, very negative way. In May of 1945, when word breaks of Nazi Germany's decision to surrender, the war in the Pacific was still raging, and news of the surrender wasn't really something that meant a lot to the men fighting in the Pacific. The Pacific was a very, very difficult place to be in terms of environment, in terms of the enemy that you're facing, and just in terms of the vastness of this theater. Americans, I think, understood Europe. They could comprehend it. Asia, I think, not so much. And if you compare the oral histories of veterans in Europe with those in the Pacific, I think you get a sense of this. It was a very difficult war and very different war, perhaps, than the one that was fought in Europe. Now, for our purposes today, the story of the occupation of Japan begins in mid-August 1945, when Japan announces its intention to cease fighting. And as in May of 1945, this news is met with elation all around the world because it basically means that World War II is over and the Allies have won in both of these major theaters. I think for some people, victory would have seemed very complete at this point. And few people were probably thinking about what happens next in terms of Japan. Looking at Japan, same time, August 1945, Japan has been at war at this point since the 1930s. Its economy is pretty much shattered at this point, and they use the term yakinohara, or burned plain, to describe the country. 68 Japanese cities have been wiped off the map, 66 of those due to conventional bombing, 2 due to the atomic bombs. Schools, hospitals, transportation infrastructure, communications, a lot of farms, they've largely been destroyed or terribly damaged in this war. You have 2 million dead, and this is almost an entire generation of young Japanese men. You also have about 15 million people in the country that are homeless. And as people struggle to survive, order is going to break down. There's going to be gangsterism, lawlessness. The Japanese are also going to be confronted by disease, by famine, and, most understandably, a sense of fear. It is basically a country on its knees, kind of looking for some sign of hope. And into this drama steps General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur. On August 14th, he's informed that he will be the Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, and he's going to run the occupation of Japan. It's a job that I think he had been laying the groundwork for since probably late 1942. It's a job that he sees as his destiny. He was a man who believed that he was a man with a great destiny, and he sees this occupation of Japan as part of that. Think what you will about his flaws, and I think we could do an entire session on kind of some of those, but there isn't a serious scholar today who thinks that he was the wrong choice for the job. But why was he such an inspired choice? Now, he had a lot of experience in Asia. He serves 4 tours of duty there from the time that he gets his commission in 1903 to the 1930s. And his second period of service in Asia starts in about 1905, when he serves as an aide to his father, an army officer, a general, who was sent to Asia to do some fact-finding. His father believed that Asia was the future and that it was going to be intertwined with the United States in the years forward. He travels with his father from Japan to the Khyber Pass, across India, across China, and then back again through what is basically most of Southeast Asia today. The trip leads him to gain an appreciation of the huge economic potential of Asia, while also kind of forming a very nuanced understanding of the billions of people there as nuanced human beings. He sees the people living in Asia as not dissimilar from himself and from his fellow American citizens. He sees them as people with aspirations, as people who, have families and who want, in some cases, to be free of colonial oppressors. By the end of the trip, he's developed a very deep distrust of the colonial system, and he develops a belief that such system sows seeds for future conflicts. And he leaves the region with a very strong belief that race has no bearing on anybody's capabilities. And this is going to be really important because he's deciding this about 1906. He's going to carry it with him for the rest of his life. And as a young officer, he's going to start meeting and befriending a lot of the future political and intellectual and military leaders of Southeast Asia. And so he's forming these connections as a very young man. And a lot of these people that he's meeting are going to see him as somebody who's not racist and someone who's anti-colonial. And if they're going to have to deal with an American, they want to deal with him. Also, flash forward a little bit in his life, World War I. We have MacArthur, a young officer fighting in that war. He's one of the most popular battlefield leaders of the AEF. And he, when the war ends, is absolutely devastated by the Versailles Treaty. He's deeply troubled by what he experienced on the battlefields of World War I. And he feels that the treaty in 1919 basically betrays the sacrifices of the troops that fought in that war. And of the Versailles Treaty, he writes that it's more like a treaty of perpetual war than a treaty of perpetual peace. He believes that World War I failed off the battlefield. And, from 1941 to 1945, he's determined that World War II will not fail in a similar way. And from the very start of World War II, I think as soon as, maybe not the start, but maybe by the time he gets to Australia in 1942, he has an end game in mind. He knows that this war must win the peace. And he knows what a successful peace should look like. And victory on the battlefield is step one. But then there's other steps that must be followed. And he's going to try to put those into practice in the occupation that he will run. I'm not really sure that any of the other generals or admirals out in the Pacific in 1945 had this far-reaching vision that he did, or had this experience in Asia to kind of make them a very good fit for this job. And lastly, another reason why he is a very inspired choice, theater. He is the greatest actor of the 20th century. I don't think there are many arguments against that. He is very ridiculed for this, particularly in the United States, and particularly by a lot of Westerners. But he's basically a master of information operations, a master of propaganda and self-promotion. This pays huge dividends in the occupation of Japan. There, I think, are many moments in history when optics add to your arsenal. And I think the Pacific there were a number of talented, excellent officers out there, but none of them have the ability or the desire to turn in an Oscar-worthy performance. And MacArthur's talent as a showman is going to be a major part of the occupation, and it's going to pay huge dividends for the United States and its policy there. So say what you will about him being very theatrical, very dramatic. It's all true. There are circumstances, especially in the occupation, where that is the personality, that is the level of drama that's needed. And again, it'll pay huge dividends for his country. Now, one final point. MacArthur was a great student of history. And as he prepares to set up the occupation, he lets his staff know that the odds are against them. He knows that history proves that great battlefield victories unravel in occupations, and he knows that the great captains of history, Alexander, Napoleon, Wellington, Kitchener, he knows that all of these men have seen great battlefield victories just kind of dry up in occupations and unravel. Being MacArthur, he naturally sees these men as his peer group, and that can be weird to a lot of people, but it masks the fact that he has studied the problem of occupations for decades. He's discovered what he sees as kind of a pattern, how to have a successful one versus an unsuccessful one. He has formulated a plan to achieve that, and he's determined to break the mold and be successful. And he goes into the occupation with a very short list of must-haves to be successful. The Japanese have to think that he is invincible. The Japanese have to think that he is all-powerful, and the Japanese have to believe that his leadership of the occupation is absolutely legitimate. So invincible, all-powerful, and legitimate. Now, he believes that this will ensure the cooperation and the agency of the Japanese people if he has these three advantages in his pocket. Once all this is achieved, he hopes to proceed with the occupation in a very pragmatic and culturally sensitive way. Now, let's talk about Invincible. How does he pull off Invincible? Days before the war officially ends, August 30th, 1945, MacArthur lands at Itsugi Air Base in Japan, and this was a center for kamikaze training. Again, the war is not over at this point, and he does this on purpose, and he lands with minimal bodyguard. He's then driven about 20 miles to Yokohama in a car that breaks down, every so often along the road. He's traveling a road that's lined with Japanese soldiers, still armed. No one takes a shot at him. His arrival is quite publicized. He's a massive target, but he assures his staff that the Japanese are very disciplined. The emperor has told them the war is over. They've been ordered not to shoot MacArthur during this trip. And, he tells his staff, Japan is absolutely safe for me to visit and to walk about in. And this is basically the first impression and image that the Japanese have of him as the conqueror. The impression, I think, is a very powerful one. On one hand, his fearlessness makes him seem untouchable, but it also drives the Allied victory home further. But then it also speaks to something else, perhaps to an idea of respect. There's a sense that he understands and respects the concept of discipline that is so important in Japanese culture. And I think this is something that perhaps gives a lot of the Japanese a little bit of hope that this might be somebody who understands us just a little bit. I think at this point, had he been killed on this trip, I think the war would not have ended the way it did on September 2nd, 1945. When Winston Churchill hears about MacArthur's visit and his entry into Japan this early, he says that it's one of the bravest acts of the war. And so this is the way that MacArthur presents himself as invincible, one of these pillars that will support his occupation. All powerful. Well, days later, on September 2nd, he's in charge of the surrender ceremony. There's no mention of George Marshall or President Truman or the other Allied leaders. Combined with the landing at Itsugi, this gives the Japanese the impression that he is all-powerful and omnipotent in a sense. Is he on his own in Japan? Does he have total control, no oversight? Of course not. He is under the authority of Truman, the JCS, and the Far Eastern Commission. He's also supposed to be under the control of something called the Allied Council for Japan. He will wriggle free from that last commission that I just mentioned. But for all intents and purposes, he is under the control of Allied leaders, President Truman. So he's not on his own in Japan. But he does, in terms of the Japanese people, try to position himself as the font of all authority in Japan. And his personality and leadership style are pretty suited to reinforcing this concept and this perception in Japan. And legitimacy. How, when you start an occupation, do you let the occupied people know that you are now the legitimate ruler? Early in the occupation, MacArthur is sent a message telling him that he doesn't need to concern himself with the status of the emperor. He's basically to understand that he is the authority in Japan. The emperor is kind of irrelevant at this point, according to the State Department and even the White House. They'll figure out what to do with the emperor perhaps at a later date. From the start of the war, though, MacArthur always believed that the emperor would be a key part of legitimizing any occupation. And in the person of the emperor, he said, you have the religious, political, and military leader of a nation in one person. And he knows that the Japanese people are waiting anxiously for signs of what the occupation is going to be like in the future. And because he's this master of theater, he knows that a properly staged meeting with the emperor could give the occupation the legitimacy that he wants so bad, and that it can help assure the cooperation of the Japanese people. But he also knows he can't appear desperate for the meeting, and he can't yield the high ground in terms of the optics of the relationship. And so he plays a waiting game. He does nothing about the emperor. He doesn't ask to meet him. He doesn't try to go see him. And Hirohito is the one that eventually sends MacArthur a message requesting a meeting and offering to come see MacArthur. MacArthur has this message leaked so that everyone knows that the emperor is making this first overture and is thinking about taking that unprecedented step of visiting someone else. The emperor doesn't go see people, people go see the emperor. So this is a very kind of unprecedented offer. Then he has his own response back leaked. And he basically tells the emperor, don't come to my military headquarters. There's tons of press around there. And, he basically says, come to my private residence, away from the press, away from the idea of a photo op with you having to march through my 6-foot whatever honor guard. I don't want to humiliate you in that way. Come to my private residence and we'll talk. This is going to be just incredible. MacArthur will have the emperor come to his residence. They'll take this famous photograph. They'll talk. He'll have this photograph kind of sent throughout Japan. If one single photograph can, do anything incredible, this does that. It basically sanctions and legitimizes the occupation of Japan. It's a brilliant piece of theater. It establishes the emperor as an essential part of the occupation, and it secures what we would today call a soft occupation. The occupation of Japan is not going to be a hard military occupation. It is going to actually use Japanese people and Japanese institutions to run. But this meeting, this photograph, this really sets up a way for that to happen. Again, MacArthur believes that the emperor is very important. The emperor has helped him secure legitimacy in terms of this occupation, but he also is going to protect the emperor from war crimes trials. And he receives a lot of criticism today because of this, but he does it because he basically believes that that is the best way to run this occupation. And I think you can very easily argue today that MacArthur is the architect of the myth that Hirohito was not involved in any of the military decisions that Japan made during the war. that he was pushed into rubber stamping what really, really bad, mean militarists were doing, and that he was just a harmless biologist that was looking at specimens under his microscope for most of the war. A scholar and a gentleman, but not a war maker, not a war criminal. And obviously there is a lot of pushback against that today. But MacArthur just believes that the emperor is essential to this occupation's success, and he's willing to kind of make those concessions in terms of protecting the emperor from war crimes trials by doing this. Throughout the occupation, MacArthur is going to be very remote. The emperor in Japan was traditionally very remote as well, but respected and obeyed. And MacArthur will try to play a very, very similar role. Overall, in the time that he is in Japan, he's going to work very hard not to overexpose himself to the Japanese people. If you lived in Tokyo, you might be able to see him drive by every now and then. He would kind of come and go from his office to his house several times a day. But he's not going to go to baseball games. He's not going to throw out first pitches. He's not going to go to social events. It's one of the most beautiful countries in the world, and he never goes anywhere. He's very remote. He works 7 days a week, but he's this ever-present, unseen power throughout the country. I think by being very removed, by not needlessly humiliating the Japanese, and by fitting into kind of a mold of power that's very recognizable to the Japanese people, he gives them spiritual and psychological space to accept the occupation and to kind of come to terms with defeat in this war. There's no quest for vengeance in daily life. Japanese people don't feel that from the occupying forces. That is going to be saved for war criminals, and we'll talk about that in a little while. So how well does this occupation go from the start? Well, a Japanese journalist, Kazuyoshi Yamazuki, writes an autobiography of MacArthur at the start of the occupation. And he describes MacArthur as a living god and a reincarnation of the first Japanese emperor, who's come back to restore Japan to the community of nations. 7 months into the occupation, this book has sold about 800,000 copies. Now, you have censorship during the occupation. MacArthur's headquarters is running this censorship. Now, there are hardly any accurate passages in this biography of MacArthur, but the occupation people don't censor it. All right, so it's allowed to go to press, it's allowed to be distributed throughout the country. We can laugh and think this is very foolish, but it ignores kind of something very important. The Japanese are very hungry for information about MacArthur. They are willing to see him in a heroic, positive light. I don't think he was a big fan of this book itself. I don't think he actually believed what was written in it. But I think he felt that if this is what people need to buy into this occupation, he was willing to try to play that character. So again, that role of theater. This is also kind of a level of very popular homegrown propaganda that you can't buy. His occupation forces could not generate this level of kind of positive kind of information about him. Here you have Japanese journalists kind of doing the work for the occupation, PR and Psy-war people. So again, some good start to the occupation for him. There's also a famine in Japan, especially in that first year of the occupation. And the Japanese are facing also terrible medical shortages that are very difficult. The US and the Allies at the start of the occupation are absolutely determined that no money will go to Japan to rebuild. There is not going to be a Marshall Plan for Japan. And MacArthur, meanwhile, is in Japan, and he sees this huge humanitarian crisis developing, and he acts, even though technically this is not something that the US and the other countries want to see happening. But he brings food stores and medical supplies into the country. This saves millions of lives, and it kind of endears him to the Japanese people. He understands some things. He understands Bushido. He understands the idea that when you are in charge, you have a responsibility to those people in your charge. He understands the difference also between hungry, desperate people and the difference between hungry, angry people. And he believes that you can win the hearts and minds of the former. If you end up with hungry, angry people, you end up with revolution or insurgency or other problems. And so he plays a very direct role in trying to kind of stop this famine and to make sure that the basic food and medical needs of the Japanese are met early in this occupation. We also need to recognize that there's significant Japanese agency and cooperation throughout the occupation. Scholars tend to refer to this as the bamboo strategy, the idea that the Japanese decide to bend but not break in the occupation, to kind of wait out the occupation in the areas where they're uncomfortable with it, and to bend with it where they must. MacArthur doesn't want the Japanese to break. He sees nothing fundamentally wrong or evil about Japan or the Japanese. He just has a problem with militarism, and that is going to have to go. That is where he believes Japan went wrong. He will be very, very clear about this. Things are going to have to change in Japan. That change will be swift and jarring in some areas, but Japan is not going to be left a blank slate. The Japanese culture is something to be celebrated, he believes, just minus militarism. The Japanese will respond to this in a very pragmatic way. They will weather the purges of militarists. They will weather the changes brought by the new constitution that he will help put into place, but they will remain a people with an ancient heritage and be very proud of that heritage. And that is something that MacArthur definitely supported. I think the thoroughness of their defeat in World War II and the early success of the occupation really allow for this. Most of the policies of the occupation will be pretty benevolent and reasonable. And there's really not going to be a lot of reason for your everyday Japanese citizen to resist the occupation. I want to talk a little bit about the Soviets in the occupation. So, what do you do with the Soviets in the occupation of Japan? MacArthur is not a fan of how Germany and even Korea are split up into occupation zones. He wants to prevent that from happening in Japan. And he understands that he is in charge of essentially an allied occupation, and he will have Commonwealth troops under his authority, but he is absolutely against having any Soviet troops in Japan. Lieutenant General Kuzma Derevienko, the Soviet representative to MacArthur's headquarters, will bear the brunt of this rejection. He will show up for appointments with MacArthur, and MacArthur will essentially ghost him. He'll be told that he's got the wrong day, wrong time, and the general's not available for him to meet with. At one point, Derevienko is arrested for reckless driving in Tokyo by Japanese police, and he demands an apology from the Japanese police force, and he storms into MacArthur's office and tells him, you need to make this go away from me. And MacArthur rebukes him and says, you've got to follow the laws. These policemen have the right to deal with you this way. And, he just tells him again, we have to respect the Japanese laws. Yes, they lost the war, but, this is a civil occupation. Later on, Derevienko will tell MacArthur that, the Soviets are going to try to put a division or so on Hokkaido. MacArthur says that as soon as they do that, he will arrest him and throw him in jail. And that's kind of the end of that. I think this is the one area where Truman and MacArthur always agree in terms of MacArthur's treatment of the Soviets wanting to come into Japan. MacArthur also convinces Washington that by keeping Hirohito and protecting him from war crimes trials, that the US will help avoid creating a cultural vacuum in Japan that would be filled by Soviet-style communism. And as the Cold War is ramping up, Japan is the place where the Soviets can most easily be countered. Derevienko is eventually recalled to the Soviet Union because he's not really having much say in the occupation and he's not having much success with MacArthur. But then he'll return, and MacArthur will tell him that, I'm so happy to see you. I was pretty sure that once Stalin got you back, he was going to chop your head off. So they have a friendly relationship, but the Soviets are not really able to exercise any authority in this occupation of Japan like they'd like to do. So the bottom line is basically there's no political tension in Japan like you see in Germany, in Berlin, or in Korea. Japan will be one unified country. MacArthur is perfectly happy if Japanese want to be homegrown communists. He is absolutely opposed to them being influenced by the Soviets in any way. So the occupation begins with these 4 goals. They are to be carried out again with no aid to Japan, with no Marshall Plan to rebuild. Today, some scholars will cite racism as the reason for this, and perhaps that's how some American politicians felt. But really, this was something that even MacArthur thought would be best. Aside from his early humanitarian invention, to MacArthur, he's always anxious that America's allies be strong and independent, and he sees Japan as a future ally and believes that Japan really has to play the biggest role in reinventing and rebuilding itself. And in doing so, someday they will be an ally that doesn't have to be propped up or constantly bought, and that then they'll have the pride of having restored their own nation. And so these are the 4 goals that he has. Now, first goal is going to be to demilitarize Japan. This is the number 1 most pressing goal. And it starts immediately with the collection and destruction of military equipment throughout the country. 1.3 million rifles are seized very early on in the occupation, 1.2 million tons of ammunition, 190,000 coastal and field artillery pieces, and the merchant and naval fleet, whatever survives of it by this point in September 1945, is pretty much destroyed as a way to kind of make sure that Japan is fully demilitarized. Then we have repatriation of all of these Japanese troops that are all over the Pacific. Over 9 months, starting in October 1945, 4 million Japanese servicemen are repatriated to Japan. The Soviet Union has about 1 million of these men. They refuse initially to send them back. Eventually, they'll send about 700,000 back, but about 300,000 will never return. This is going to present the occupation administration just an incredible task of how do you integrate these young men back into society, especially when the economy is just not where it needs to be, when infrastructure throughout Japan is so destroyed, when you've got this issue of famine. What do you do with millions of young men that don't have work and who were soldiers or other military servicemen? Education reform and land reforms will play a major role in kind of solving the social problem of reintegrating these men. Massive education reform is going to take place very early on in the occupation. Students and any ages, Japanese citizens, workers, they're all going to be encouraged to believe that Japan is not racially superior to any other country. And that Japan has, no right to war. There are going to be purges of militarists who work in education, who work in kind of government. There will be purges of militarists who are politicians or obviously military leaders. Anybody who helps shape or kind of foment Japan's militaristic identity, they are purged from their positions and they're replaced with other people. Dissenters who had been arrested by the Japanese during this war for perhaps being against militarism or criticizing the war effort, they're let out of prisons and they're invited to play what MacArthur calls a subdued role in Japanese life. The goal is to let these people out. The goal is not to antagonize the former militarists with them, but to create more of a marketplace of ideas, of competing ideas, of alternatives to militarism. And so these dissenters are let out and kind of encouraged in a very subdued way to kind of talk with their fellow citizens about alternatives for Japan, alternatives to militarism. Then it comes to war crimes trials, and the Allies really want Japan to pay for World War II. It was an absolutely brutal war, lots of war crimes, and they want to see people punished. And MacArthur sees this as part of the re-education of the Japanese people as well. He sees no need to kind of visit vengeance on the rank and file, but he does believe that some examples have to be made. War crimes trials are going to be held all over the Pacific in places like Manila, Singapore, Yokohama, Morotai, Tokyo. Thousands of Japanese servicemen will be accused of war crimes and atrocities. Hundreds will be executed for these crimes. But the most controversial trials are probably in Manila. The trials of General Homa and General Yamashita. These are the generals that dealt MacArthur his biggest personal setbacks during the war. And many observing felt that he had his hand on the scale of the trial and that these men probably didn't receive fair trials. Aspects of the Yamashita trial will go to the American Supreme Court. It's a very liberal court at that time, but it sides with MacArthur. And Truman is in agreement with all of this. And very like a lot of legal scholars today believe that there was probably an obstruction of justice during this particular trial, but there's also the idea that, you know what, someone had to be punished. And so everybody perhaps looked the other way. The biggest trial, though, will be in Tokyo, and that will be before the International Military Tribunal of the Far East. And that's when Tojo and other very, very high-ranking people will be charged with crimes against the peace and with waging an aggressive war. 7 of them, including Tojo, will be executed in 1948. Another way the occupation seeks to re-educate Japanese citizens is through museums and the arts. And you've probably heard of the monuments men in Europe. Well, they were in Japan too. But in Japan, their role is different. Their role is one that is more about censorship than actually kind of going around protecting cultural objects from war. They're going to go through museums and religious sites throughout the country and make sure that the content doesn't glorify militarism. They're going to help Japanese cultural institutions get grants to stay afloat and share Japanese culture with the rest of the world. And they're going to be very, very successful in this mission. Museums and cultural institutions, I think even today, have very powerful voices. And MacArthur realizes this, and he's always happy to exercise what he calls soft power in this arena. And what's interesting is that his wife, Mrs. MacArthur, will become a great patron of arts and culture in Japan and really help there to be a lot of cultural interchange between the United States and Japan while they're there in country. Another goal that MacArthur has is to redemocratize Japan. In 1945, an individual's average rights in Japan are somewhat limited. Only landowners and the very, very wealthy could vote or own property. Ownership of industry and big tracts of land was pretty much controlled by a few dozen zaibatsus, or families that kind of controlled access to production, industry, banking, and labor. And this effectively put control of the country in the hands of a very few elite. Women had few rights, minorities had few rights, and there was no freedom of the press or freedom of speech. Now, I say MacArthur's mission was to re-democratize, and that's basically because Japan had experimented with a more democratic system earlier in its history. The 1868 Constitution of Japan had come out of a period that kind of created a system in Japan that was a mix of Prussian and British governing system, so kind of half constitutional and half absolute monarchy. But by 1945, there are a lot more structural problems in Japan, and you've got the problem of how do you deal with the militarists. And MacArthur decides that, we can't just go back to an 1868 constitution. We have to do something more dramatic to assure a new course in the future for Japan. And so he asked the Japanese to come up with a new constitution. And he gives them some pointers about what he would like to see in that. They submit to him a draft a little while later, but it has nothing that he really wanted to see in it. And so he steps in. And a new constitution will be drafted, and this will be mainly written by MacArthur's occupation headquarters staff based off of a list of things that he wants to see in it. And his inspiration, he says, comes from the Bill of Rights, the American Constitution, the British Parliament and constitutional law, the Swiss Constitution, the Gettysburg Address, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the League of Nations, and what I find most interesting, the New Deal. Now, he raged against the New Deal in America. He thought the New Deal was absolute socialism and it was going to destroy America. But he's very happy to use a lot of those policies and concepts in the remaking of Japan and the Japanese Constitution. The new Constitution is about 5,000 words long. It goes into effect May 3rd, 1947, and it guarantees a parliamentary system of government and certain fundamental rights for all in Japan. It features the end of feudalism, universal suffrage, freedom of speech and of the press, and many other kind of almost revolutionary concepts. The most important part of the Constitution, though, for MacArthur is Article 9. And this is a part of the Japanese Constitution in which war is renounced as a right of the Japanese state. And MacArthur sees this as his greatest achievement and as kind of the biggest victory, the biggest stepping stone in terms of winning a permanent peace between the United States and Japan. Women's suffrage is also going to be enshrined in the Constitution. Aside from Article 9, MacArthur is most proud of this. He informs the Japanese government very early on in the occupation that this will be non-negotiable. He says there can be no democracy if half the citizenry are disenfranchised. And I think as a 19th century Victorian, he also thinks that women are just better than men. He just thinks that they are more decent and will bring better judgment to politics. Now, today we reject kind of blanket characterizations like that. But whatever his personal thoughts about this, he's absolutely committed to giving women the right to vote in Japan. And he's also interested in marriage rights. And under the occupation government, mutual consent to marriage becomes a law. Essentially, women cannot be forced into a marriage. They have to say, yes, I want to be married to you. Now, this is all about picking apart the power of the elite. And I think MacArthur believes that the militarists were a lot of men, it's a very kind of chauvinist system. And I think he thought by putting women into this equation and kind of raising their political profile and their value as citizens in this new Japan, that there would be a way to kind of combat that militarism from ever coming back. First elections are held about 1946, 1947. Japanese women turn up to vote, and MacArthur is thrilled by this. There had been a big propaganda campaign by his headquarters to get out the word, to get women to vote. Political scientists and anthropologists said that it couldn't be done in such a traditional society, but turnout is high and women are even elected to office for the first time. And it is a huge step for Japan. MacArthur doesn't leave it there, though. After the election, he meets with the women who've been elected. This shows, I think, his support for them. And he wants to show the Japanese people that, these women are not going to be token members of this legislature. He plans to back them. He plans to see them, and to have more women elected even in the future. But he does something very interesting. He also warns these women to avoid coming together and just becoming a women's bloc interested in women's issues. He tells them that they need to meet the men on the floor in complete equality, and that they need to represent all of Japan going forward. Moving on, land reform will also be kind of something that he's very interested in. In pre-war Japan, 2/3 of all agricultural land was rented and not owned by the farmers who farmed it. And farmers at this point in Japan make up about 50% of the workforce, and they tended to pay about 50% of their crops in rent. The average farm size was about 1 acre. And that's not a lot. If you are farming to support your family and you also have to pay this kind of 50% of your crops in rent, it makes for kind of subsistence living. And farmers generally are going to be living in poverty. Occupation era land reform is essentially going to take land away from major landlords and redistribute it to farmers who own very little or no land. This to a lot of people sounds like socialism and the redistribution of wealth. things that MacArthur was very, very much against. But yes, this is exactly what he's doing in Japan. He's kind of very flexible in terms of his ideologies there, because he feels that Japan is different than the United States, and what works here will maybe not work there, and vice versa. MacArthur believes that if the farmers become more economically independent and that they rise to someday form a middle class, that then they will participate more freely in the democracy. If he feels that if there's a path to some sort of generational wealth, that new middle class can be a bulwark to those elites, those militarists who kind of turned Japan in the wrong direction in the 1930s. So does he want to see any of this in the United States? Absolutely not. But he believes that it's really important to do this in Japan, and he's faced with the problem of what to do with all those millions of Japanese service members being repatriated back into the country. They don't have anything, they don't have a way to make a living. Here's some land, now you can be a farmer. So it's kind of also a way to kind of deal with that influx of soldiers returning and needing to put them to work or let them own something, so that they're less inclined to some kind of insurgency. Now the zaibatsus. So these are those giant kind of family business corporations in Japan. They controlled Japan's industry and pretty much Japan's economy. MacArthur and Eisenhower are always in their life talking about the military industrial complex. And this is that to the nth degree. Initial occupation policy is to turn Japan into an agrarian powerhouse and to break up the giant corporations that help lead Japan into war. In the summer of 1945, MacArthur is moving forward very quickly with this, seizing the holdings of these companies, breaking up monopolies, stuff like that. And then suddenly, reverse course comes into play. Now, Cold War tensions are rising. The cost of the occupations in Europe and Japan are pretty enormous, and they start leading to a reassessment of occupation policy. And the US government comes to an idea that Japan can be a better bulwark to communism in Asia if it's not some, agrarian backwater, but if instead it's an economic powerhouse, if it's kind of a great capitalist country. And so MacArthur will be told, it's time for you to switch course. All right, you've been breaking up all these, you've been kind of breaking up these monopolies. Okay, never mind with that. We need Japan to have a very kind of strong industrial base, reverse course. And so he reverses course and he embarks on a policy with a lot of Japanese cooperation to make sure that, Japanese corporations are in a better place than they were during the early stages of the occupation. And this is the reason today that we have many of these companies you see on the screen and the descendants of zaibatsus around today. Japan is to be an economic powerhouse, and midway through MacArthur's running of the occupation, that becomes his new goal. In the end, Japan's post-war economic recovery is ultimately assured by the Korean War. Not maybe so much by reverse course, although that doesn't hurt, but it's mostly the fact that from 1950 to 1953, Japan will become the industrial supply depot and an important base of operations for American troops in the Korean War. And again, later in Vietnam, Japan will be the same thing. So in the case of the Korean War, Japan at this point is only 5 years removed from that devastation of World War II. And I think this just gives you an idea that what an incredible transformation happens in that country in about 5 years of this occupation. MacArthur will serve as commander of United Nations forces in Korea while he's still in charge of the occupation of Japan. He's in his 70s at this point. Technically, he had retired from the United States Army before World War II started and then was recalled to active duty. He's got 2 major jobs at this point in his career. And when he's fired by President Truman in 1951, he's removed from both the occupation of Japan and from his leadership of the Korean War. He'll return to the United States after this, and he'll be returning for the first time in over a decade. That's how long he'll be out of country serving in the Pacific. Reactions to his removal in Japan are not what a lot of people might assume. The Japanese are pretty worried about this. They really don't want to see him go. It is a traumatic moment for many of them, and there is great concern over what will replace him. And there's actually more support for his presidential ambitions among the Japanese who can't vote in America's elections than there will be in the future in terms of American support for his presidential ambitions. The fears of the Japanese people, though, are pretty unnecessary. By the time he's fired in 1951, the occupation has pretty much accomplished its goals, and it's almost over. The formal peace treaty between the Allies and Japan is signed in September 1951, about 5 months after MacArthur's firing. And MacArthur's not part of the ceremony that takes place in San Francisco, but it's something that he had been a major architect of. This is a glaring sight. The Japanese think it's very rude that MacArthur is not part of this since he's had such a big role to play in it. But that he's fired, it's not appropriate, according to the Americans, to have him there at this point. So his presence is just not appropriate. A year after his removal, the occupation itself ends, but the framework for close kind of US-Japan bilateral relations is firmly established, and it obviously continues today. And I think this makes the occupation of Japan one of the most successful in all of history. As we look at Asia in the post-World War II period, you see most of the Allies were not willing to give up their colonial possessions in that part of the world. You have the British, the Dutch, the French, all of these groups across these territories, they want to keep hold of their colonial possessions. And you see a lot of civil unrest and violence in these areas as the people that live there want to kind of have independence. In contrast, I think after World War II, the United States goes through some very interesting kind of revolutions. You have Philippine independence in 1946, and then you have the occupation of Japan led by an anti-colonialist Douglas MacArthur. And so I think this is very significant. So there are missteps coming in terms of American policy in the future, but I think initial American policy in Asia is set up very well initially in the post-war period. And I think MacArthur is a big part of that in terms of the Philippines and Japan. Now, the Japanese perspective of this occupation. After the tsunami that devastated Japan in 2011, Japanese media agencies reached out to get the rights to this particular image, MacArthur arriving at Atsugi right before the end of the war, right before the main occupation starts. They printed this in Japanese newspapers in the wake of that disaster, and the message was, have hope, endure, we can rebuild again. And I think what's interesting is that, almost 70 years later, MacArthur's arrival in Japan in 1945, far from being seen as a moment of absolute defeat, is seen as a reminder that prosperity will return, that Japan is never defeated, never destroyed. And so I think this is very kind of significant. About 10 years ago, this was kind of the perspective of that in Japan. Now, MacArthur is often referred to as the American Caesar, and this is why. Like Julius Caesar, he's not lovable, all right? No one will argue with you about that. Like Caesar, he could be a great battlefield commander in times of war. The nickname Dugout Doug is fake news. Like Caesar, though, he was a master propagandist, and it's easy to kind of despise the drama and ego that he brings with him. But at some points in his career, this certainly made him look very foolish, but at other times, his mastery of information operations and propaganda paid huge dividends for the United States and for the mission. And finally, like Caesar, he could be a great civil administrator. And that is the legacy of Japan and US relations today. The occupation of Japan wins the peace, and it's a peace that honors the sacrifice of the service members who gave their lives in the Pacific Theater. And I would argue that Japan-US relationship today continues to honor these sacrifices. So thank you very much. That was kind of an interesting overview of the war. But if there's any questions, good to go.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Amanda. That was an incredible presentation. For our audience members, if you are watching us on Zoom, Make sure to place any questions that you have within the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching on Facebook, please place your questions as a comment and we will go ahead and jump in because Amanda, we have a ton of questions already. So the first question that I have for you is from Robert. He asked, how long after MacArthur arrived in Japan did he have that meeting with Hirohito?
Happens in the first month, happens in September, September 1945. It's very, very early in the occupation.
So building on that, Jim asked that, or he explains his question first a little bit. So I understand the cultural reasons for keeping the emperor in place, but what were the arguments for not keeping him in place other than the ones advocating for justice for his alleged war crimes? And who made these arguments and did they matter?
There are a lot of politicians, Democrats and Republicans in Congress, who just don't want to see an emperor there. They see this as very kind of outdated. That, you cannot have kind of a modern new Japan with this kind of even a constitutional monarch. And so they are very much in favor of, we just got to get rid of them. Now, the war crimes don't hurt because they've got a lot of constituents who might have been POWs or people whose family members died because of atrocities. But you've got a lot of politicians basically saying get rid of them. You also have a lot of New Dealers in Roosevelt and then later on, obviously Truman's administration, who just think, well, we don't want an emperor there. And again, atrocities are always going to play a part of it. War crimes will always be a part of that argument. But just this idea that how can you have something new and modern with this ancient or this kind of not democratic model. But MacArthur is just insistent from the beginning. He believes the emperor is the linchpin to all of this. He believes the emperor will kind of help prevent a cultural vacuum that will not allow us to win the peace there. And so he pushes back against all of those arguments and he eventually wins. He's also got a lot of guys on his staff that are, know quite a lot about Japan, know a lot about Japanese culture, and they're kind of helping back him up, make these arguments in favor of keeping the emperor.
Absolutely. So looking at occupation itself, Becky on Zoom asks, what was there a Soviet allied occupation of Japan really discussed in a similar way to what the Allies were doing in Europe?
Right. So yes and no. I think the fact that Japan proper is not occupied when technically they surrender, they've been firebombed, they've had atomic bombs dropped on them. The idea is basically, no troops had a foothold there already. And the Americans already kind of island hopping through the Pacific and ready for the invasion of Japan are ready to get there. And they're the first ones that get there. And then you get the Commonwealth troops coming in. The saying often attributed to MacArthur is that, the road to Tokyo went through the Pacific, not through Manchuria in the final hours of the war. And I think, the Russians, they end up getting to play a part in the occupation of Korea because they've got boots on the ground there, like when the war ends. They don't have those boots on the ground in Japan, and they're never able to get them there because MacArthur and Truman are just, they don't want that. And so they do a good job of keeping them out and kind of, I think it definitely is good for the occupation that's the way that shakes out.
Definitely. So switching gears just a little bit, we had multiple questions, one from Zoom from Janice, one from Facebook from Susan, about what role, if any, did MacArthur have in the rebuilding of the Philippines? Not
much at all. He goes there. Today's the anniversary of that, him landing at Leyte in 1944. They'll have they'll take Manila in 45. They'll liberate some camps. once he starts kind of looking towards Japan, and once he ends up there in the occupation, he does not have a role in terms of what's going to happen there politically, or what the rebuilding is going to look like. I mean, he kind of goes to Japan and that's it. He'll go back to the Philippines towards the end of his life in the 60s. You know, he'll always be connected with people there. He loves the Philippines, but he's not going to have any kind of official role in rebuilding or anything. He's kind of done with the Philippines after he leaves in 1945.
Gotcha. So switching back to Japanese occupation, Jim asked, what major mistakes did General MacArthur make during the occupation?
I would say that, you know, some of the most criticism that he receives is stuff having to do with the war crimes trials and maybe putting his finger on the scales. That is obviously kind of problematic. I think there are also other people that would say him protecting the imperial family is a mistake and should not have been made. And then I think one that a lot of people don't know about is there's a lot of censorship, and the American people don't know much about the atomic bomb and what it has actually done to these Japanese cities and the long-term effects that, you know, they begin to realize in 45 and 46 that, you know, radiation is not a good thing for the human body. And initially the government says, okay, we need to like not let reporters tell the American people about this because, you know, we have these war crimes trials to go through and we don't want people to be overly sympathetic to the Japanese. And we also don't want people to be anti-bomb yet, you know, because we're going to be entering this Cold War period and we kind of need this weapon and we need more of them. And so, you know, he's going to play a role in that censorship that tries to keep most journalists out. Now, there will be a journalist who will publish something in the New Yorker that will get this information out, and it's going to horrify people. To MacArthur's credit, once it's out, he doesn't try to kind of tamp down on the story. But he was someone who hated these bombs. He hated anything that targeted civilians, non-combatants. And, you know, he helps hide the story for a while until it's out. And I think that may be something that he regretted later on.
So taking a look at the Constitution, we actually had quite a few questions related to the Japanese Constitution. So the first one is from John. Was Japan's new constitution made effective and issued by General MacArthur as an executive order, since presumably Japan didn't have an elected legislature or government in existence at that time?
Okay, they technically do. Again, it's a soft occupation, not a kind of a hard military occupation. And so essentially MacArthur, when he asked for that first draft of the Constitution, he's talking to a committee of Japanese leaders to draft this. When they don't do it the way he wants to, his headquarters kind of takes the lead, but then it's approved by the emperor, and it's kind of, I don't know if ratified is the right word for it, but it's basically accepted by the Japanese government and by the emperor, who gives it his seal of approval. So it's not something that he kind of issues as like, this is an executive order from the occupation. It is something that the Japanese participate in, they accept, and they basically kind of ratify as their new constitution.
So Jim asked, did Article 9 in the Constitution effectively obligate the United States to defend Japan?
Not within the Japanese Constitution. Article 9 doesn't say, hey, we're never going to go to war, but if something happens, the US, you'll help us. But, you know, technically by kind of demilitarizing Japan and kind of very much limiting their ability to defend themselves, the United States does take on that responsibility, especially once the treaty is signed and you know, the relations between the two countries are normal. So yeah, it's a very interesting time for that too, because if you're watching the news right now, Japan is possibly going to be changing its kind of military, its stance on the military and its ability to defend itself. And interestingly enough, it seems that the United States is very, very supportive of that, because with China, you want a stronger Japan, not just an economically strong Japan, but perhaps a more kind of military capable Japan. So it'd be interesting to see what happens. But no, Article 9 doesn't say the US will help us if we need it. but that will be kind of the default mode that will happen in the future.
Absolutely. So we do have a ton of questions. I do want to thank everyone for submitting them. And Amanda, a lot of people have said this has been an excellent presentation. But the final question I would like to ask you is from Lisa. She says that her view of MacArthur has been greatly overhauled after reading Embracing Defeat, Japan in the Wake of World War II by John W. Dower. She wants to know, one, your thoughts on this book, and then I want to add, do you have any other resources, books, etc., that you would recommend on this topic?
Okay. I haven't read that book in a very, very long time, so I can't really comment too much on it. What I've been reading lately, there are a bunch of books about MacArthur and his relationship with the different Japanese political leaders. And of course, the names escape me right now, but they're books that have been written in kind of the last 10, 15 years, but they deal with kind of the Japanese agency in the occupation and MacArthur's just kind of how he figured out the things like the Constitution, how he pushed through reforms that the Japanese politicians weren't really fans of, but were willing to kind of bend and not break, and how he understood the kind of, that bamboo psychology of Japan. I always recommend that people just read a good biography of MacArthur, because a major part of his story is the occupation. Whether you read the William Manchester one or the 3-volume James set, I think you will be surprised by the man that you meet. He's very complicated. Again, he's not lovable, but I think you see somebody who served his country to the best of his abilities, and someone that, while we Americans can't see it, he was really the best foot forward for many of these countries in Asia. We may not like him today. We may be kind of 50-50 on him. But when you think about the perception that people had of him in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, particularly that World War II generation, they thought he was the greatest American that ever lived. We don't feel that way all the time, but I think if you read a good biography of him, I think you will get a sense of that, particularly as it comes through the occupation.
Absolutely. Well, Amanda, thank you for taking the time to share with us about MacArthur's role in the occupation of Japan.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And I also want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this program, I encourage you to follow us on Facebook, to regularly check our website, as we have lots of upcoming programs, particularly from our Lunchbox lecture series to our Meet the Author series and so forth. Now, we do have an upcoming Lunchbox lecture in 2 weeks on the impact of the war on Native Americans and their identity and citizenship. So I encourage you guys to join us for that on November 3rd at 11 o'clock Central Time. And in the meantime, take care, and we look forward to seeing you next time here at the National World War II Museum.